Thanks for clicking! It's time that Canada start preparing for another Trump presidency. This according to a number of news articles coming out over the past few weeks.
Why would that matter?
Indeed, as the former president's poll numbers surge, in the wake of President Biden's poor debate performance last month, as well as the events over the weekend, it's becoming more and more likely that we'll see a change in administrations in the United States. And while the Globe and Mail ran a fairly extensive article on how a change in the administration could affect Canada, which was sort of well done, it lacked a discussion of potential monetary and fiscal changes that could affect us here north of the border. So what I want to do today is very briefly go over the Globe and Mail article, take a look at some of the potential impacts to the Canadian economy that could stem from a second Trump presidency, and then discuss some implications. Whether or not Trump will once again ascend to the presidency remains to be seen. But, as we'll see, the prospect does bring with it some potential changes to Canada's status quo. We will continue to monitor these potential changes on this channel. Click like and subscribe to get those updates, but for now, let's get into this Globe article. Onto the article. Very briefly, the Globe and Mail ran an extensive article looking over potential difficulties coming to Canada should Trump once again ascend to the presidency, with the first being Canada increasing its defense budget, given Trump's insistence that NATO members fulfill their obligations. The article also went over the divergence on the green agenda, lower taxes in the US luring away Canadian businesses, mass immigration coming from the US based on Trump's previous mass deportation plans, as well as the reopening of the USMCA, formerly NAFTA, in 2026. All of which, or some of which, are fairly decent points. With that said, the article also went over truth and the potential for Canadians to not be able to tell the difference between what is true and what is not, which, given the state of Canadian media, the argument is a little rich.
Thank you so much.
And while all of these, or some of these, are fairly good points, the article was lacking in a discussion of US fiscal and monetary changes, both of which, as we've talked about on this channel and is completely ignored by Canadian media, have a direct impact on our economy and our cost of borrowing. First and foremost, the Federal Reserve, of which the former president was incredibly critical during his previous term. Trump slammed the central bank publicly in 2018 and 2019 after it raised interest rates. Trump obviously wasn't the first president to try to influence Fed policy, with Reagan attempting to influence Paul Volcker back in the 1980s, but it's not usually done so publicly. And while as of recent the campaign has said that Trump will allow Fed Chair Powell to serve out his term, which expires in early 2026, we have also heard murmurings that the former president might want to shake up the Fed, enabling more direct control from the White House. Were Trump to try to gain more control over the Federal Reserve or replace Powell with someone that was more pro-low interest rates, we could see a Fed more prone to loosening, more prone to lower interest rates. And were that to be the case, that would put more pressure on our own central bank, on the Bank of Canada, to lower interest rates as well, as a depreciating dollar would make our exports even more expensive. It would also put more downward pressure on inflation, as imports would be cheaper with a weaker US dollar, but as we'll see in a few minutes, there would be other inflationary pressures, or could be other inflationary pressures, showing up elsewhere. So on the monetary front, Trump did show throughout his presidency a preference for low interest rates. Although most presidents want low interest rates, Trump showed himself to be a little bit different by being so publicly adamant. With that said, through the US system of checks and balances, it's not as though Trump can do whatever he wants once he gets into office. Were he to try to stack the Federal Reserve with loyalists, he would need Senate approval. Trump tried to appoint Stephen Moore and Herman Cain to the FOMC back in 2019 and was blocked by the Senate. Further, if the new president were to try to change the Fed's mandate, change the extent to which the Fed targets inflation or targets employment, that would also require an act of Congress. As such, both of these scenarios are at least somewhat unlikely, unless that is, the Republicans sweep the House and the Senate, though that's not exactly out of the realm of possibilities either. So, at least in the short term, and I stress short term,
Forever.
in the short term, if the Republicans sweep the House and the Senate, we could see Trump alter the Federal Reserve in a manner that would favor lower interest rates. But that's just monetary policy. Let's also consider monetary policy within the context of US fiscal policy, and how that fiscal policy could affect us here in Canada. Year to date, as of right now, the US deficit is running at $1.27 trillion. And suffice to say, if Trump were to ascend to the presidency, there's a good chance that he would extend the Trump tax cuts from 2017. This would put even more pressure on U.S. borrowing on the U.S. deficit, as even right now, the U.S. is spending far, far more than it brings in. Though, just very briefly, as we talked about this at great length on this channel, U.S. structural debt problems are already nearly insurmountable, and even a Biden election would lead to a higher deficit as well. But Trump putting relatively more pressure on the bond market, borrowing relatively more money in his term, has the bond market worried about inflation, with yields popping up over the events of last weekend. If you're an investor and you're going to be loaning the United States money and its policies lead you to believe there will be inflation, hence your dollars that will be returned won't be worth as much as when you lent them, you're going to demand a higher premium, a higher yield for loaning that money. And we saw this in the increase in the 10-year yields on Monday, which, as it almost always does, translated into higher yields, a higher cost of borrowing for Canada. These were marginal increases in yields being demanded by investors after the events of the weekend, but this is all speculation of a Trump win on the part of the investors at this point. And we actually saw the Trump effect, or Trump trade, whatever they're calling it, on display a few weeks ago in the wake of the debate between Biden and Trump, when Canada's yields went up, right along with the US, as investors think that a Trump administration will be more inflationary than that of a Biden one. So, taken all together, if we get a Federal Reserve more likely to cut rates, that will lead to lower interest rates in the short term. But if we also get the higher deficits and the inflation that comes with them, we'll see higher interest rates in the longer term.
This is coming out of nowhere.
With that said, let's just be clear, as we've talked about so many times on this channel, the US was going to have a major deficit, a major debt problem anyway. The timeline could just be sped up a little bit if Trump gets the presidency, especially if those tax cuts aren't allowed to expire. And finally, on the inflation front, tariffs. The former president showed throughout his term that he was not afraid of imposing tariffs on China. Even Canada wasn't safe from protectionist inclinations. And this time around, those protectionist inclinations have not subsided, with Trump once again talking about tariffs on Chinese goods. And while I think the severity and the extent of those tariffs towards China are probably overblown, history shows that he's not afraid to go that route. Obviously, if Canada were to be targeted once again by tariffs coming out of the US, we would probably again respond in kind. According to a recent study from Scotiabank, were the United States to impose a 10% across-the-board tariff, that would lead to a 3.6% decline in Canada's economic activity, a 1.7% higher inflation rate, and 190 basis points higher policy rate. So, were Trump to carry on with the protectionist impulses, that would indeed be inflationary for Canada, again leading to a higher cost of borrowing. Now, and this is just speculation, Canada has shown, at least as of recent, a willingness to toe the line on tariffs on protectionist measures for China. So I think it is a possibility that Canada could use that as a bargaining chip when dealing with the United States. So in the short term, we could see the new administration put even more pressure on the Federal Reserve, on the central bank, to lower interest rates, which would probably lead to lower interest rates here in Canada. However, continued pressure on the US deficit, which was probably going to happen anyway, but the timeline would be augmented a bit if the tax cuts get extended, could push interest rates up higher in the long term. The bond market is very much like the Iron Bank. It will have its due.
Okay, geek.
And finally, tariffs could push interest rates up even further long term, as the central bank is forced to deal with the inflationary pressures stemming from said tariffs. Now, all of this obviously is at its very early stages, and even the best political scientists in the world will tell you they have no idea what's going to happen in any election. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem will no doubt start being asked very soon, if not at the next press conference, whether or not the Bank of Canada is prepared to deal with another Trump presidency, a question for which there is absolutely zero chance the governor is going to answer.
Sometimes I got nothing to say.
But, as we've seen, a Trump presidency does have the potential to cause a major change to the status quo in the Canadian economy. And I think it's worthwhile that we start to include that possibility into everyone's calculations, into everyone's projections. We will continue to monitor those calculations, those projections on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates. But for now, thanks so much for watching.